Hello and welcome to State of the Division, this time with UFC 298, the second card of the year 2024. And honestly, it's a solid card. The main events obviously are great. You have Volkanovski at Topuria, which will be a fun fight. You have Whitaker-Costa, a fight for both a quick rebound and to keep the streak going and get back to title contention. And all through this card, you have sort of placement fights. Fights with fighters on a skid trying to find their footing. Fights with fighters trying to find where they place in their weight division's rankings. Overall, it's an interesting fight card. Now, there are some newcomers, obviously some Contender Series alum, and some people looking to get their stuff kickstarted in the UFC. But overall, I'd call this a pretty enjoyable card. However, we do have a butcher's bill and some housekeeping to do. Now, in terms of housekeeping, as you can see, my record from the first fight, I went 7-5. Calling 7 fights correctly, 5 fights wrong, but getting the main event right and calling that Du Plessis would win the fight. Though honestly, that was a 50-50 gamble, I feel. I'm still taking credit for it. But on to the butcher's bill, and it's not a small one. So Kinoshita, who's supposed to fight Barlow, is out. Barlow is still on the card and will now fight Quinn Lan. We'll figure out who that is, whoever. Tuivasa and Tybura are both off the card. I am unsure who got injured, but both fighters are no longer fighting, which sucks. Tatiana Suarez is off the card, but her original opponent is still fighting. Ikram Askarov is off the card as well. Not great. And Treshian Gore, literally in the last moments of writing the script, I found out was off the card, taking out AJ Dobson with him. So the butcher's bill is not small. So we do have some of the general last-minute replacement fights with fighters I don't have a lot of info on. Thankfully, I think these fights still provide interesting challenges and interesting fights overall, but it is a bit of a long butcher's bill, and it's not great to have this in the second fight card of the year. That being said, I think it's time to jump right in. Starting off the card, 13-8, Andrea KGB Lee, out of Shreveport, Louisiana, looks to snap her losing streak against 12-5, Miranda Fear the Maverick. Maverick is 8 years younger, but Lee does take 3 inches in height and 4 in reach. Lee comes into this on a 3-fight losing streak and is a little hard to read. Numbers-wise, she runs with a 4.91 to 3.69 striking with only 3 career KOs and 1 of those in the UFC. So the striking is functional, if not her ultimate strength. Backed up by a pretty solid 1.84 takedown average that she is able to bring out with a solid consistency, though other fighters can take control of the takedown game when facing her. Maverick is a bit similar in the numbers, 3.71 to 2.62 in striking, which served to back up a 2.41 takedown average. And that's where the main difference is. Maverick's takedown game is a bit more aggressive in comparison, plus she's able to hold the advantage with more consistency compared to Lee. Additionally, she does have more finishability with submissions. Vegas likes Maverick, and I'm going to agree. Her ability to shoot takedowns, especially with Lee's 54% takedown average, gives her a definite edge in my mind when I'm looking at this fight and comparing these two fighters particularly. Could Lee win? Yes. But I just think Maverick's more aggressive takedowns, the fact that Lee has lost control of the takedown game and the ground game in turn, gives the edge to the fighter with the more success on takedowns. 9-2, Oban, the Welsh gangster Elliott, looks to get his first real UFC win, because Contender Series doesn't count, against 7-1 Valentin the Animal Woodburn. Elliott is 4 years younger, either 3 or 4 inches taller, with 2 in reach, going to Woodburn. Elliott is coming off a Contender Series win, which I feel sums up his recent MMA game pretty well. He's a grinder. He has 4 career decision wins, 3 submission, and 2 TKO KO, but it is worth noting that his last non-finished win came in May 2022. With the UFC numbers, he has the 3.87 to 2.80, showing that functioning striking repertoire, and it does seem to back up his takedown game, which sits at a 4.0 flat. And in his one UFC fight, he landed 4 of 9 for 4 minutes and 25 seconds of control time. Woodburn is coming off a loss to Bo Nickel, but does seem to be a little similar, if only in result. He's got 5 career KO TKO wins with 2 decision wins, with his last finished win being in 2021, though he has fought less than Elliott. Stylistically, I feel he falls more into the striking heavy style where he wants to stay on the feet and pull his power out. But in his one UFC fight, he was severely outpaced and outstruck by Bo Nickel. Vegas takes Elliott by a good margin, and quite frankly, I'm going to agree. I don't got a lot out of these fighters, and I'm always tentative to believe the Contender Series numbers, but Woodburn looked very outclassed against Nickel, and without a whole lot of info, I'm going to default to what Vegas says, and I'm going to go with the guy who has the better takedown game, who has the ability to grind, versus Woodburn, who has struggled a little bit more. 6-1-0-1, Josh Bushio, or the Renegade, Quinn Lam, looks to get back on track against 7-0, Danny Left Hand to God Barlow, who wins worst ring name while also being 2 years younger, 2 inches taller, while taking a whopping 7 inches in reach. Kunlan is still relatively new to the UFC, but numbers-wise works with a 3.68 to 5.97 in striking with a .84 takedown average. And now, I feel that his striking has been good in regards to power, not so much the landed to absorbed. He was able to bring it out in his no contest against Logan Urban and the win over Jason Witt. But then if you look at his fight against Trey Waters, he was outstruck severely, 50 to 104. So we see that he has the ability to finish a fight, but it doesn't seem like he's able to adjust his game plan or adjust his approach to the fight when faced with certain opponents who are able to neutralize his power and avoid a lot of his offense. And his takedown game really is negligible, and it seems to be a reactionary part of it versus a consistent plan in his fights. He can shoot them, but it's more of a bag of tricks versus that consistent piece we see with some other fighters. Now, Barlow is a complete newcomer to the UFC with only a Contender Series win. Career-wise, he's got 4 KO, 1 submission, and 2 decision wins. And in his Contender Series fight, he was able to KO his opponent Raheem Forrest in the first round, outstriking him 16-7 with punches to the body. That's about all I got. By a narrow margin, Vegas goes with Barlow, and for much the same reasons the last fight, I'm going to agree. Now, part of it is that Quinlan hasn't impressed me that much with how he's fought. He hasn't really adjusted well, and with other fighters, we see them get hit more, but they're able to lure their opponent into the phone booth and go. It hasn't seemed like he's been able to do that. And while I think Barlow could lose this fight, I'm more confident going with Barlow based on what Vegas says than I am going with Quinlan based on what I've seen on the UFC stats for him. Taking us out of the early prelims, 16-6. Minyang Mountain Tiger Zhang, I'm so sorry if I got that wrong, looks to go 2 in a row in the UFC against 15-5-0-1. Brenson, the Gorilla, Ribeiro. Zhang is 2 years younger at 25, 1 inch shorter with 6 inches of reach going to Ribeiro. Zhang is, as mentioned, a relative newcomer going into his second UFC fight, and I feel I can safely call him a finisher. Career-wise, he has 10 KO and 6 submission wins, cementing that fact, so far at least. In his UFC fight, he finished Tuco Tokos, in the first by KO, outstriking him 35-22 with a knockdown also going his way. He was taken down once, was able to minimize damage. Now, he has been submitted and finished before, but it seems to be more so outliers compared to how he is fighting recently. Ribeiro is coming off a Contender Series win and also feels like a finisher as well. 9 KO and 6 submission wins in his career. Now, he has paid the price and lost twice by both submission and KO, but overall seems pretty good at avoiding the worst case scenario. His Contender Series fight had him KOing Bruno Lopez in the first while outstriking him 32-20 with 0 takedowns, though I imagine decent on the ground with that submission record. Vegas rolls with Zhang by a narrow margin, and based on not much, I'm going to disagree. This is mostly going on a limb, but I'm going to run with Ribeiro here because I feel like both fighters are very similar, and the submission game that I see with Ribeiro might be something that gives Zhang pause, as if he wants to go to the ground. Ribeiro seems to be able to play off his back a little more. Again, this is mostly a gut feeling. I don't have a lot of numbers for this one, and quite frankly, this can go either way, but I'm going to run with Ribeiro on this one. The new opener of the prelims, 8-0 Rinya Hybrid Nakamura, looks to stay perfect against newcomer 11-3 Carlos Pequeño Vera. Nakamura is 8 years younger at 28, 1 inch taller, with not a single clue in reach, though Nakamura has a 68-inch reach. Nakamura comes across as a finisher with 5 career KO wins and 1 submission, with 3 of his 4 UFC fights ending in the first. Now, he does have a preference for the feet, since in the UFC he rolls with a 4.23 to 1.78 in striking, and with that he can definitely bring out power in order to put his opponents away. I don't know about his variety of strikes, but he does have a head kick KO on his record. When it comes to the ground game, he currently has a 4.23, which is pretty good, honestly, but that is based across 6 takedowns across 2 fights. I'm inclined to believe it is a matchup decision over a consistent game plan feature, though he did take 9 minutes of ground control off 4 takedowns against Fernie Garcia. Vera is a UFC newcomer and brings what looks like a real dangerous ground game with 5 career submission wins and what seems like the ability to play off his back or out of position. I will say I don't know his takedown game or takedown defense, which does pose some questions. Nakamura is the heavy favorite at -1,000 according to Vegas. And unshockingly, I'm going to agree. Ribeiro has so little data, not to mention how successful Nakamura has been in the UFC, that I'm hard-pressed to pick against him. Could Ribeiro win? Yes. The thing is, I can't really think of a reason how. I don't know enough about his game to really make that decision, and don't know enough especially to pick against Nakamura based on what I'm looking at. 21-9-1. Marcos Pizarro Reguero de Lima looks to get back to winning against 7-3-0-1 Justin Bad Man Tafa. Tafa is 8 years younger, with 1 inch in height and reach, rolling to DeLima. Now, DeLima is a bit of a grinder who relies on his power and takedowns to control his opponent on the ground. But obviously, there is some power lurking there capable of ending the fight. He is a heavyweight. In striking, here is a 3.61 to 2.96, which isn't too surprising given the heavyweight status, and the fact he seems to take punches in exchange for the takedown and control time aspects of his game. And yes, he does have heavyweight power, as I've mentioned. His takedown game sits at a 1.34 and tends to make an appearance in his more recent wins. He does also have a submission game, which does add to his bag of tricks. Tafa is much more of a swang and bang heavyweight, a 5.13 to 5.93 in striking, with definite power that he can bring out in spades. But of course, that does require him to wait in the fighter to do so, but he seems more than willing to do that. We have seen him struggle with fighters that were able to manage him, like Jared Vanderaa, who was able to mitigate his power and contain his offense. On that note, he also doesn't have a real takedown game. He does carry a 100% takedown defense so far. Vegas likes DeLima by a narrow margin, and I'm a little torn. The narrow margin makes sense. Both these fighters are capable of ending a fight quick, with Tafa holding that advantage in the striking for sure, but I'm more inclined to agree with Vegas and go with DeLima. Tafa does have a 100% takedown defense, but I don't think he's faced a fighter like DeLima, who's very good at the takedowns, and if he doesn't get the takedown, is good at putting you against the cage and controlling your offense. We saw Tafa struggle with Vanderaa, who's able to mitigate his offense and his power, and I imagine that DeLima has the ability to do the same, and likely will be able to do that in the fight, especially if it goes to the ground. Ending off our prelims. 13-3-1. Amanda Hina Lemos looks to rebound against 13-4. Mackenzie Dern. Now, Dern is 6 years younger, with even height across the board, but 2 inches in reach, rolling to Lemos. Now, Lemos is a high-octane finisher who thrives on getting after her opponent while letting her power and dangerous ground game do the work. Numbers-wise, she rolls with 3.54 to 4.66 in striking, and while she does tend to get hit, her power acts as a great equalizer that makes stepping into her danger, and much can be said about her takedown game. Solid takedown ability at 0.82, coupled with the submission ability that makes going to the ground dangerous. I will say she very much lives by the finish, and in turn will die by the finish. Not to mention that we have seen it happen before where her offense is controlled, though that may have had more to do with Zhang Weili. Now, Dern is much more of a grinder as of late, and while she does have submission ability, her last successfully landed one was April 2021. Now, her striking isn't outstanding at 3.49 to 4.21, but it's functional enough to keep her in fights and set up the ground game. In that, she carries a 0.77 takedown average and is very good at getting control time off them, generating points. In that, she carries a 0.77 takedown average and is very good at generating control time and points off of them. Takedowns aren't incredibly accurate, which is a weakness, as good takedown defense can stifle a large part of her game, and that is seen especially in her fights against Amanda Ribas and Marina Rodriguez, who both limited her takedowns and in turn her ability to throw submissions. By a narrow margin, Vegas takes Lemos, and I will agree. Dern has been hot and cold, and despite Lemos coming off a loss, I think Lemos is the hotter hand at this time and is much more high octane, which I think works against Dern. Both fighters can go to the ground, but I think Lemos can play off the back better than I think Dern will be able to control from the top. Opening up the main card proper, 11-2-0-1. Anthony Fluffy Hernandez looks to keep rolling against 12-2 Roman Koplyov. Hernandez is 2 years younger, with even height and reach across the board. Hernandez is a bit hard to categorize, but to give my best label, I'd say he's a finisher on both the feet and the ground. Numbers-wise, in striking, he carries a 4.33 to 3.36, and while that's pretty close, he packs some dangerous power and is capable of putting people away. As a whole, though, I'm willing to say that his striking is mainly there to back up his ground game, where he carries a 6.79 average and has a dangerous submission game along with that. In his last 2 fights alone, he racked up 14 successful takedowns for 15 total minutes of ground control. Now, given that he is a finisher, he does bear the burden of being open to being caught, but on the same note, he's able to neutralize a lot of offense of his opponents and prevent that from happening. Koplyov also comes across as a finisher, though he's definitely more of a striker in comparison. Numbers-wise, he runs with a 4.72 to 4.11 in striking, with a definite touch of power in his style. Not to mention the variety he seems to be able to mix in to that style. He does carry a 0.47 takedown average, but that's definitely a situational or recovery over a consistent game plan aspect. I will say that in this fight, I feel the 92% takedown defense matters a great deal more. Vegas likes Hernandez, and I will agree, mostly based on his takedown game. And while Koplyov can defend takedowns, I think we run into the issue of how many he can defend before Hernandez puts him on the ground and steals a round. And in a 3-round fight, that matters a lot. Could Kopylov win? Yes, but I'm giving the edge to Hernandez based on the number of takedowns I think he can land, or at least is able to shoot and prevent Kopylov from either generating offense or simply taking him to the ground. 16-4, Merab, the Machine, Devashili, I'm so sorry, looks to keep the momentum going against former champion. 16-3, Henry, Triple C Cejudo. Merab is 4 years younger, 2 inches taller, with a whole 4 inches of reach, going to Merab. Now, Merab, because no way in hell can I physically say his last name, is best described by his ring name, a machine. He is constantly pushing pace and keeps his opponent working off the back foot, disrupting their rhythm and offense. Stylistically, I feel safe calling him a grinder. With the numbers, he carries a 4.46 to 2.41 in striking, with an insane 6.55 takedown average. Now, in striking, it is very much the case of output over power, as in almost every UFC fight but his first, has led the fight in strikes. But the main strength of his style is the ground game, and with that, the main strength of the ground game is the constant output. He is constantly shooting and forcing his opponent to defend and look out for it in all aspects of the fight. He's able to generate control time off takedowns, but that can be varied depending on the opponent and the number of takedowns landed. Now, I would be remiss not to mention the sheer number of takedowns he can land, with 11 landed in his last fight out of 49 attempts, but Cejudo is a very different case. More so a finisher looking at his recent fights, but capable of controlling an opponent and going the distance. In striking, he runs with a 3.39 to 3.15, which isn't outstanding, but his power provides an edge. Not to mention the takedown game, which sits at a 2.07 average and seems to be pretty consistent as a part of his game. He doesn't really tend to get submissions off those takedowns, but the control and disruption he's able to generate benefits his style. In a similar vein, he often tends to want to control when they go to the ground, with an 83% takedown defense and a definite preference for not letting his opponent lead the ground game. Vegas has it close and gives the edge to Merab, and this is a hard one for me. On one hand, Merab has that high output, high octane style that can put a fighter on the back foot very easily and force them to play defense for so long. However, this is a 3-round fight going against Henry Cejudo, who's again a very good wrestler. However, once again, Cejudo is much older, so the question becomes, can he match the output of Merab? I'm going to say that I'm not quite sure how this fight's going to go, but I think it will go in Merab's favor. I think Merab, at worst, is going to be able to output enough strikes, output enough takedown attempts, output enough takedowns, that Cejudo is going to be limited in what he's able to do offensively, and he's not going to be able to really dominate Merab or put Merab in too many dangerous situations, because he's going to have to defend the takedowns or consistently look out for them. This is a fight that I really feel like could go either way and should be a really good one, because I think Cejudo has the edge in power and probably has the more dangerous striking, while Merab can swarm you and kind of tag you up for points and put you on the back foot. It's an interesting conundrum. In the end, once again, I am going to go with Merab here, but this should be a really close fight and a really good one. 15-5, Jeff Hands of Steel Neal, that's hands with a Z, looks for the quick rebound against the surging 13-0, Ian the Future Gary. Gary is 7 years younger, 4 inches taller, with a whole inch of reach, going to Neal. Neal's an awkward fighter to get a grasp on, but as a whole, he puts his ring name to use and relies on his power as a finisher. He very much keeps fighters honest with his stand-up and definitely relies on his ability to bring power to put other fighters on the back foot very quickly, with the numbers backing this up. 5.22 to 5.60 in striking. Now, he does tend to take the striking lead in his wins, but never really by a large amount, keeping it close and not letting his opponents breathe. Additionally, he has a present takedown game sitting at a .51 average. It isn't always present or even effective in his fights, but it's something noticeable in his toolbox to pull off to recover or disrupt his opponents. Gary is a bit hard to get a read on stylistically, since in some measure he's a finisher with 7 career KO TKO wins, but on the flip side, he carries 3 decision wins in the UFC with 5 total in his career. Numbers-wise, he rolls a 6.67 to 3.58 in striking and a .67 takedown average. In the striking, he can pack a KO punch, but does seem somewhat dependent on the opponent. With others, he relies on taking the striking lead and limiting the effectiveness of their offense. On that note, his takedown game serves a solid supplementary piece, letting him gain recovery time and disruption of his opponent's offense. Vegas picks Gary, and I will disagree. I won't be surprised if Gary wins this fight. I think he's fully capable of. But I think that Neal provides a very different challenge here in the constant knockout threat that he is, and the fact that Gary does tend to want to strike with his opponents. Could he shoot takedowns this fight? Yes, but I feel that Neal here is able to match the takedowns or at least defend against them good enough. So it's a fight where stepping in to engage is dangerous, as Neal always has that KO threat. And in my mind, that gives him the edge to either put Gary away or force Gary to be honest and possibly catch him on the back foot enough to take the fight away. For the co-main event, 24-7, Robert the Reaper Whittaker looks to re-enter title contention with a win against 14-2, Paulo Borrachinha Costa. Costa's a whole year younger at 32, with either no difference or a single inch in height going his way, with an inch of reach going to Whittaker. Now, Whittaker is very much still the Bobby Knuckles we all know and wish could hold onto a belt. He's a very well-rounded fighter, capable of working well on the feet or going to the ground. Carries a 4.47 to 3.39 in striking, and while he doesn't really have all that much knockout power, he is more than able to match fighters' output and rack up the totals for points. He backs us up with a 0.85 takedown average, and while it does have a consistent presence in most of its fights, it's not a requirement in his style to win, and he can very much work without them. Now, overall, I'm going to say his style is based around matching his opponents and mitigating their ability to use their strengths. Looking at his fight against Marvin Vettori, he came in and outpaced him in the striking, but did so by keeping him from landing takedowns, preventing him from using his wrestling, which was a major strength of his game. Costa is a very different story, and is much more of a finisher with a definite preference for the feet. In striking, here is a 6.50 to 6.38, which does highlight the reliance on power and willingness to wade into fire that is his game. He does have the power with 4 of his 6 UFC wins and 11 career wins coming by KO, TKO. He has been working in takedowns more recently and does have a 0.53 takedown average. Looking at his fight with Luke Rockhold, he was able to land 2 takedowns for 5 minutes on ground control and take the striking lead. In all, this does add another layer to his game that I think is worth noting. Vegas likes Whittaker by a decent margin, and I will agree. I think Costa has a blueprint to win this fight, but I think the issue becomes that Whittaker is very good at disrupting those blueprints. Whittaker is very good at matching your strengths and mitigating them as a whole. Looking at his fights with other fighters who were power threats, looking at his fight with Cannonier, he was able to avoid a lot of damage, and if he did take it, he was able to mitigate the result of it. I think going into this fight with Costa, I don't think the game plan is the same, but I think the logic is the same. You're going against someone who's very big, who's very strong. I think Whittaker has a game plan in mind that's going to be able to work against Costa and prevent him from bringing out the most of his strengths. For the main event, 26-3, Alexander the Great Volkanovski looks for another featherweight title defense against the challenger, 14-0, Ilia El Matador Topuria. Topuria is 8 years younger, 2 or 1 inches taller, with 2 inches in reach, going to Volkanovski. Now, I feel Volkanovski can best be described stylistically as a chameleon. He's well-rounded and capable of working with different game plans that all depend on the opponent he's facing. In striking, he carries a rock-solid 6.19 to 3.42, and while he can get KOs, the main strength is the swarming nature of his punches and the ability to drive his striking total up. He does have a decent variety of strikes, but the boxing is definitely his main trick. This is all backed up with a 1.84 takedown average, and much like his striking, has the ability to stack the takedowns when needed. Now, he won't always shoot takedowns as it's dependent on his opponent or the situation, but consistently present is the takedown defense sitting at 70%, and in the featherweight division, he hasn't had a takedown scored against him since his fight with Brian Ortega. Now, Topuria is much more of a finisher on both the feet and the ground, with 4 of his 6 UFC fights not going the distance. Numbers-wise, here's a 4.44 to 3.05 with some dangerous power hanging in the wings. With most of his finished wins, he tends to keep it close with opponents in terms of the striking totals. A 20-22 KO win over Jai Herbert, 18-10 KO win over Ryan Hall, with 31-16 over Damon Jackson being the outlier there. Now, the striking backs up a dangerous takedown game sitting at a 2.19 average, and with that, he's able to stack takedowns and generate control time and generate disruption off of those. Not to mention the fact Topuria is a submission threat, and being on top gives him a lot of options. He also seems to be able to play out of position or from his back, with submission victories coming without landed takedown. Now, Vegas gives the narrow edge to Volkanovski, and I am going to agree after a little deliberation. I think Topuria is a massive threat, not to mention the fact that Volkanovski is 35 years old. But Volkanovski's style, being that chameleon-esque thing that I've mentioned, I think is an amazing strength that he has. I think it's something that Topuria is going to have to try to figure out to solve in 5 rounds. Because we've seen him handle great strikers on the feet. Max Holloway to Korean Zombie. And the question becomes, can Topuria dominate him on the ground? Well, we've seen him avoid going to the ground with other featherweights. And we've seen him survive being on the ground with other dangerous featherweights. So the question becomes, is Topuria going to be able to surpass him in those regards, or is his game plan and his skills going to hold Topuria off to get to the end of the fight and win the belt? In my mind, I think Volkanovski has the edge there. I think Topuria could win, but I think it's a longer shot for Topuria to win than it is for Volkanovski to do what Volkanovski has done his last few featherweight title defenses. Now, in the end, that's UFC 298. And as I said, it's a remarkably solid card. I was not expecting to go through this and look at this card and enjoy it as much as I did. I think you're going to have a lot of fun fights on this card. I think the main event is great. The co-main event is fun. I always love a heavyweight fight, so I'm not even going to complain about that one. And I think overall, we're going to leave this card seeing a lot of divisions knowing the future for a few divisions here and seeing what contenders we might have in these ranks. Well, that being said, those are my picks. Those are my analysis. Tell me what you think in the comments. Thank you for watching. Have a great fight.